Chavre, how are you? A good Erev Shabbos. Today is Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Beha'aloscha. I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. I hope everyone is strong, healthy, strong and happy physically and spiritually. Right now, as we speak, there is very, very big news in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has made a preemptive strike on Iran, and it's a state of emergency, so we really have to intensify in Torah and mitzvahs and tefillah. So we'll start with the pasuk from this week's Parsha, which unbelievable, we heard the news Friday. This morning, Erev Shabbos Kodesh was the news in Australia. So the chitas, the chumash of Yom Shishi in Parshas Beha'aloscha is Vayehi ben Seyar and Vayem Meisha. Kuma dinoi v'yifutzei vecho v'yinusa misanecho mipanecho. Whenever the ark, the ark would set out, Moshe would say, "Arise, Hashem, and your enemies will be dispersed, and your foes will flee before you." Amen. Since we have a clear message, as long as we connect ourselves to the Torah, to the Aron, will affect v'yifutzei vecho v'yinusa misanecho mipanecho. So that was our tefillah. Now we're going to give tzedakah, and now we'll connect it with the parsha of the week. And the truth is, I see it as a continuation of what we spoke last week, but from a different angle. Last week we spoke about Avodat Torah, and we spoke about the concept of Avodat Torah to the concept of Torah, but everything associated with Torah. The scholars that learn Torah, the teachers that teach Torah, and so on and so forth. So this week, the truth is, there's two places that have the same theme. We'll see how much time we have. I'm gonna concentrate more on the second story. But first, let's talk about the two themes the theme that I see twice in this week's parsha, and then we'll get into the details. This week's parsha starts by Beha'aloscha Saneis. It's a command to Aaron that the kohen has to kindle the menorah. But as we know, hold on, the pasuk says, first they brought it to Moshe, and then Moshe gave that Shemen Zayis to, so to speak, Aaron, and then they kindled the menorah. By the way, we find a similar relationship, dynamic, that in the Parah Aduma, we say that the Parah Aduma, the first one, had to be burnt through Moshe Rabbeinu, even though he's not the one who actually carries out the service of purifying the one who is impure. So same idea over there. We start with Moshe Rabbeinu. It has to be attributed to him, like Shemen Zayis v'yichei. And the same thing is concerning Zeis Chukas HaTorah, that it was connected to Moshe. La'olam, it's always going to be called on your name, as Rashi brings that over there, see there. Now later on in the Parsha, we see a similar theme, and that's really what I want to focus on today. It's a very, very interesting story, the story where it's the Yidden were complaining to Hashem. The Yidden complained to Hashem and about their diet. They were stell sich vor, Jews complaining about food. Anyways, so they're complaining. And there's different ways, the commentaries, obviously there's so many different layers over here, but you could learn it on a certain level that Moshe Rabbeinu is completely humbled. He sees it as a failure of his leadership. See the verses, and part of the words that Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ma'ayin li basar, from where I'm meant to get meat, to feed the people. And he's saying that Le'uchal anechi levadi losis, as kol ha'omazeh ki kovid mimeni. He says, I can't carry the burden alone. It's too much for me. Anyways, the response to this whole dialogue is that the Eibishter tells Moshe, and Rashi brings it out straight away, that this is the response. V'atzalti min haruach asher olecho. I will increase the spirit that's upon you, v'samti aleim, and I will give it to another 70 people. And the pasuk says, Esfali shivim ish miziknei Yisrael. Gather me 70 people from the elders of the Yidden. And v'syatzu sham imach Rashi says over there, it was meant to bring respect to them. The point is, now I'm going to tell you what Chassidus says, but connected also with the similar concept that I said before about Moshe and Aaron concerning the kindling, that is Beha'aloscha, Shem and Zayis. First, Moshe has to have his involvement, input, and then Aaron. Similarly over here, we're going to see, I'm making similarity between Moshe and this Canaan. So I'll start with this Canaan and then we'll go back to Moshe. According to Chassidus, the discourses, what it speaks about is that Moshe Rabbeinu, by himself, he's in a very high level. He's in a very high level. Now, by the way, I just want to make a disclaimer. Chassidus doesn't use the exact same terminology. I'm going to use what Chassidus says in one subject, and similar to what it says in another subject, I'm going to bring it together. So concerning the story with the Shivim Canaan, Chassidus says that Moshe Rabbeinu, by himself, is a bit too high, too abstract, call it, spiritual, cerebral, call it whatever you want. And therefore he says, my only basar, what kind of connection I have with meat, which represents spirituality, which represents physicality, corporeality, not spirituality. And then the Eibishter says, you need to gather 70 Shivim Canaan. They're going to be the intermediaries to be able to bring the influence from Moshe to the rest of the nation. What sort of influence? Including the Basar. In other words, Chassidus comes to tell us that the Basar does stem and come from Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Moshe Rabbeinu is Nasi Adir, and the Nasi is everyone, and the Tzaddik Yisoid Olam, all the Ashpois in the world come through Moshe Rabbeinu, HaNasi Hu HaKol. But still he needs second lieutenants, he needs his staff, he needs his sergeants, his captains that are able to make the distribution. So Moshe Rabbeinu by himself is still the source, so to speak. Hashem through Moshe Rabbeinu, but Moshe Rabbeinu on this planet starts with from him. He's the source. And then Vatsalti min haruach asher olecha v'samti aleihem. He takes from the spirit that's from Moshe Rabbeinu and he gives the people that are working together with Moshe similar abilities to be able to then have those powers to influence the rest of the nation. By the way, see the Rebbe Sikh and Chiliches, where the Rebbe talks about two analogies over here about what Moshe is compared to. One is from Rashi and one is from the Medrash. See there. My point that I want to bring out is, we have the Moshe Rabbeinu, and then we have, let's call it like Seder Shtalshus. There's an order of descent, a system, a hierarchy, call it whatever you want, which through that happens the distribution. Now similarly, we see Benegay to Moshe and Aaron. Beha'aloscha, Shem and Zayis. It has to start with Moshe, then comes the Beha'aloscha of Aaron. And the same thing with Parah Adumah. So the language which is used in the story of Parah Adumah and the Menorah, Beha'aloscha, goes as follows. That the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish nation is compared to a bride and a groom. Hashem is the groom, the Mashpia, the Yidna, the bride, the Makabel. And there's something the Zohar says is Shoshvina de Malka and Shoshvina de Matranisa. There's the, translated in English, the entourage. In Yiddish, it's the Unterführer, the one that accompanies. So there's the Shoshvina de Malka, which means the entourage of the king, Malka spelled with an Aleph, and the Shoshvina de Matranisa, the entourage of the queen. Moshe Rabbeinu represents, according to Chassidus, the Hamshachim L'mayla Lamata. He accompanies the king, like bringing the king to the chuppah, helping down to be the conduit that's going to bring the chassan to the wedding, helping the higher level come down, L'mayla Lamata. Aaron is called Shoshvina de Matranisa, the entourage of the queen. He's starting L'mata L'mayla, from below upward, accompanying the bride to the chuppah, elevating the bride. Moshe is bringing down, drawing down, eliciting the higher level. Aaron is elevating the lower level, so to speak. Now it makes perfect sense. That's why the Shem and Zayah Zoch, first comes the mode of Mumayla Lamata, from above below. Sheshvina, the way the dynamic works is we start with the Sheshvina de Malko. Afterwards, then comes the Beha'aloscha Sanelis, Sheshvina de Matanisa. Now, what this means, now we're going to take the leap and we'll discuss it the way it means l'chayra on a practical level. What do we learn out from the whole story of the Shivim Zkenim? Let us now, me and you, me, father, parent, including educator, including shliach, including, as I said before, influencer. Today we know there's a b'shagas, everybody wants to be an influencer. Hello. That's exactly what the definition, the translation of the word mashpia is. Mashpia is an influencer. And in truth, the Rebbe started this straight away with shluchim. He wanted every single person to be a shliach. He said everyone's a shliach. And which means that every single shliach is an influencer. I was by the Fabringen Parshas Chayesod Tavshem Mem Zayin, where the Rebbe cried out, "In! Geht arois und nehmt ein die Welt für Yiddishkeit." Go out there and conquer the world for Hashem, for Yiddishkeit. So he wanted everyone to be a shlich. Werd shluchim. I think the Rebbe Tak said, "In, werd shluchim und nehmt ein die Welt für Yiddishkeit." Become shluchim and conquer the world for Hashem. So now, what this means is, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbe, is making us all deputies. The sheriff who deputizes everybody. And he needs the help. Kaviyachol, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, "Le'uchal anechi levadi losis es kol ha'omazeh ki kovid mimeni." Moshe Rabbeinu himself is saying that it's a bit difficult for him to be able to carry it out himself. And then the Eibishter says, "Esreli shivim ish miziknei Yisrael." We're going to gather 70 people, and then it's going to be v'tzalti min haruach asher alecha v'samti aleim v'syatzu shamimach. So here we have all the ingredients. When is the person a shliach? When is the person going to be successful in being an influencer? When he stays connected to the Moshe. When the Shivim Ish are basking in the glory, in the knowledge, in the holiness of the Moshe Rabbeinu, then they can be successful. But now, let's take a pause for a second, and we'll discuss what else comes out of this, which is unbelievable, and that is, guess what? We learn out from the Shivim Zekenim of this week's Parsha about making a bezdin. Now, even though it's a separate mitzvah in Parsha Shoftim, of Shoftim v'Shoftim titlecha b'chol sharecha, but this pasuk in our Parsha is the source for the concept that in the Sanhedrin HaGodol there were 70 people or 71. What's the source of that? The Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Vav. And the Mishnah says as follows, Sanhedrin Gdela Hoysa Shoshim Ve'echad. The Sanhedrin HaGodol had 71 people. Umenayin Gdela Shoshim Ve'echad. How do we know that a Bezdin HaGodol had 71 people? Shenemar Esuli Shivim Ish Mizikna Yisrael. Because it says in the Pasuk, gather me 70 people from the elders. Moshe al Gabeim, so there were 70, and Moshe was on top. They became connected to Moshe. Harei Shivim Ve'echad. So we see that the Bezdin has to have 71. And what's the source of that? Our Parsha in the story of the Shivim Zkenim. Okay. So number one, we see from this Parsha, in the story of the Shivim Zkenim, that became the source of the whole idea of courts and Supreme Court justices, etc. But as I said before, let's rewind for a second. I'm translating this, applying this to every person who wants to be a leader, who wants to be a shliach, who wants to bring the message of Torah and Yiddishkeit to others. And now, I want to connect it to something which is so amazing, and that is in Rambam, Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Beis, Halacha Zayin, the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Beis, Halacha Zayin, describes the character, the good character, the virtues, the values that a Sanhedrin, a judge, had to have in the lowest court. Listen to this. And if we saw this as the 7 principles that I should be working on, it would change your life. It's a life-changing mission. But if you're a father, if you're an educator, if you're a leader, if you're a counselor, if you're a boss, if you're whatever it is in any position where others look up to you, it will be essential and paramount to have this in mind. Listen to this. The Rambam says over here, Tzarech sheyehei b'chol echad mehen. Every single judge had to have Shiva Dvarim, these 7 things. Ve'elohein. Chachma, wisdom. Anava, humility. V'yira, fear, yiras Hashem. V'sinas mamoin. He has to hate money, so then you can't buy him off. Ve'avas ha'emes. He loves truth, so he's always going to try as much as possible to be objective and never get personal or biased or prejudiced, because it's about seeking the truth. And then the last 2 things I find especially profound, and I'll soon explain. Va'avas habriyas lehen, a person who is beloved by people at large. And Ubali Shem Tov must have a good reputation. Obviously, they're all Talmidei Chachamim. But someone could argue and say, if I'm a judge, so I'm a judge. I have to study law, be cold, be indifferent, let's say in a positive way, and just try to look at it just cold, dry law. No. Besides for all these other qualities that we mentioned before, you have to be a person who's beloved by people at large. Because that, in a way, is a sign and is a testimony that you're a good person. Sorry. To be a judge, you have to be a person who's beloved by people at large. Otherwise, they'd say that you have an agenda. Today, what's the main subject that's going on in the whole polarization in America in particular, but it's also in Eretz Yisrael? That the Justice Department has been politicized. Exactly, you hit the bullseye. Now, if you say the Justice Department is politicized, forget about it. Society is over in a certain sense. But what's the reason they could say such words? Because whoever the person is involved in the court is not a person who's beloved by people at large. He's beloved by some, maybe hated by many. You need the person who is by large accepted, which means the majority, etc. Anyways, and the same thing, Baalei Shem Tov, they have a good reputation. And over here we see, these last 2 things, you could think in a certain sense, they're not so essential, they're more external. But the answer is it's not true. Sometimes you could look at something external and we say it's something essential. Like, for example, Baalei Shem Tov, the Mishnah says, Kes Shem Tov Eil al Gabeim. Let's just talk on a simple level what that means. I'm not going to go to the famous pshat, the Kes Shem Tov Eila al Gabein. It comes after all the other qualities, which could apply here too. But I'm saying in general, let's say you have, just to give you an example, we see how relevant it is. You have people that are in business. Lots of people are in business. Most people that are in business, they have a reputation. He's one way in shul and he's another way in business. Business is business, nothing personal. They're aggressive, etc. Or is their money kosher? How many people that are businessmen and big businessmen and have, let's say, huge fortunes have a good reputation? It's very rare. You know the saying, he built his fortune on the backs of others. Why do we have the whole concept of evil corporations? Things like that. Because many are those who took advantage and exploited the weak in order to gain. But if you say someone who's in business and has a fortune and he has a good reputation, Nobody has anything bad to say about him. Wow. That shows in a special character. So the same thing over here. We're talking about going through filters. We're making the choices. We're looking at the qualities of what makes a good judge. You can imagine why Baal Shem Tov is very important, etc. So let's get back to ourselves, my friends. Let's look at everyone should look inward. Chochmeh, Anova, Yira, Sinas Momen, Avas Emes, Avas Abrius Lahen, Baal Shem Tov. And I believe, I'll tell you a word that I heard from a certain Chassidish Yid. I don't know if I ever said this before. He said, when I was young, he's talking about the Rebbe and Elter Chassidim, Mashpiyim, having a Selach Rav, which that's really the message over here, that each one of us should be able to be a role model to someone else. If someone asks you to be their Rav, you should look inside yourself, make yourself worthy to be able to be someone else's Rav. And if that person's asking you, it's because he believes you have that in you. So that's number one. And number two, you yourself, every single person has to have some sort of symbol of authority, Shivim, Ziknei, Zkenim, that you could consult, you could ask, Aseh L'charav, Mashpia, etc. So, there was a Chassidish Yid that once told me that when he was talking about the Rebbe and Mashpiyim and Ziknei Anash and Elter Chassidim, by the way, I find anybody who discusses subjects. I'm talking now in the Dalar Amos of Lubavitch, and I'll ask them a question: who is your mashpia? Who are you makabel from? If they don't have an answer, it's problematic, because number one, it doesn't show how they received smicha, so to speak, how they received shimush, and in general, does it show? Are you ready to listen to authority? Are you ready to listen to receive from someone else, from someone higher? Anyways, and there has to be someone in your life, there must be someone in your life whom you see as a teacher, whom you see as a leader, who you're ready to listen to what they have to say. Anyway, so there was a Chassidish Yid, he was like 20 years older than me. He was once talking to me, I was then, let's say, 30 years old, and he was then 50 years old, and he says, ich gemeint, when he was a bacher, he says, ich gemeint, I'm a king gain to Atzmus Halei. I thought you can go to Atzmus direct. Atzmus means the Eibush himself, but what he meant is the Rebbe. You could just have your relationship to the Rebbe direct. Obviously, it means to the Eibush also similarly tzaddikim daim lebeim. We're talking about the idea. He says, I'm a king gain to Atzmus direct. Aber der Rache verstanden, es darf sein Seder Shtalshelis. But then I realized there has to be a Seder Shtalshelis. Seder Shtalshelis is the order of descent of the worlds. So the same thing over here. The lesson that we take from the story of Beha'aloscha Sanedis with Moshe and Aaron, and from the story of the Shivim Zkenim, is that there is a level of Moshe, and every single Yid has a connection to Moshe. No question about it directly. V'anosiu HaKoil, v'tzadik Yisoid Olam, and he's Roish B'nei Yisrael to Klal Yisrael, etc. Nevertheless, there's also Shoshvina de Matronisa, as in Aaron's case, and there's also a Shivim Zkenim in general. There's that distribution system where, in order for you to get clarification, in order for you to get your busser, what you need on your level, means that there's also a Seder Shtalshelis, in order of the center of the worlds. So this is the message that I'm taking from this week's Parsha, both in relation to myself, to try to work on myself to be a better communicator, a better influencer, a better person all round, because that's part of being a shliach. So inside myself, and also in general, to realize what are the virtues and the values to make someone, the ultimate is the Rebbe would say, shliach, oise shliach. You have to make talmidim, your children, your disciples, your students, gruntige Menschen, solid people. If you want them to have solid people, you have to give them the right values and virtues, but first you yourself have to be inculcated and saturated with the right values and virtues. Good Shabbos, Hashem should help that the war should be overtaken by Mamish with an etzochen, l'mayl mishul, l'gamri, didan notzach, and we should come to the ultimate didan notzach of Gula Mitzvah Shleima, take it from a yad, Mamish. Good Shabbos, posting from my home. Your man in Melbourne.